Funding for the following program has been provided by 3M Pharmaceuticals.
If you were around more than 30 years ago, your collection of favorite memories may hold at least one of these. The old neighborhood drugstore on the corner. Whatever yours was called, there used to be thousands just like it in American neighborhoods from coast to coast for almost a century. Most of them are gone now, but here and there a few remain. Not only surviving, but keeping alive those qualities that made the corner drugstore a reassuring presence.
How are you doing this morning? Good? Good. Need some more coffee? Okay.
Ms. Grosley, how are you today?
The neighborhood drugstore has a lively, colorful past. But does it also have a future? If all of them disappear, what will we have lost? The American Midwest, late 1800s, a time of emerging towns and cities. Almost as soon as a community was large enough to support one, a drugstore would spring up.
When population
University of Minnesota professor John Adams is an expert on how cities develop.
Business. It would be a function more of how many people were around and how much disposable income they had that would determine when it would come into existence, because the business of selling medicines has been around for a long time.
Most often, the drugstore would be placed on a corner.
And why would you want a corner store? In order
Dr. Frank DeGangi has written extensively on the history of pharmacy.
Obviously, an intersection would mean more people than a storefront in the middle of a block. And that's the whole answer then, was to get the traffic and to get the people to come in.
In cities with streetcars, druggists would try to place their stores at the intersections where the lines crossed.
Those were the busy intersections because that was the place where you had to change from one line to another. And businesses concentrated on those corners to capture the pedestrians who were getting off one line, getting on another, or getting off just to shop.
And what would one of these strategically placed drugstores look like around the turn of the century? Well, depending on the town, it might resemble a general store, or one of those old-world apothecary shops with colored globes out front to identify it as a drugstore, like a striped pole said, barber shop. Inside, shelves of the bulk chemicals used by the druggist to prepare his tinctures, pills, ointments, and liquids. Mahogany drawers filled with teas, herbs, and tonics, and patent medicines for all sorts of ailments. The area where the druggist worked was traditionally at the back of the store, separated from the view of his customers. Over the years, that didn't change much. But if all the druggist did was dispense medicine, he couldn't stay in business for very long.
And so the druggist had to resort to other things to do to make a living in order to keep it open for those few prescriptions a day that he filled, or the people that were really sick and came in. So that the druggist is serving both the individual who was sick and the individual who's not sick.
To supplement his income, the druggist sold a lot of other things in his store. Cigars, cigarettes, candy, cosmetics, cameras and film, toys, stationery, wallpaper, and greeting cards. Catherine Carpenter grew up in her father's drugstore in the early 1900s.
I can remember Mr. Hall, who was a president of Hall Drug, or Hall Cards, Hallmark Cards, would come in with his little satchel of cards and sit down with my father, and he would buy his cards that way.
Though trained in pharmacy, an independent druggist had to become a skilled and aggressive retailer. Kermit Madison opened his South Minneapolis store in 1934.
After I purchased a store, I put in a post office, what they call a contract station. That not only brought the people in for stamps, but it brought them in for other things that they might need. Maybe I only sold one stamp or two stamps, or mailed their parcels, or wrote a money order. But it developed into bringing in traffic, and that was my goal.
The retail section of the store was called the front end. Today, retail income is still important to survival. In Chicago, Sapstein's Pharmacy has developed a loyal following by stocking hard-to-find over-the-counter items.
We still have a reputation over all the years of being the place that if you can't get it, we're going to come to Sapstein.
Art Gordon is the store's principal pharmacist.
We still have all of the old kind of home remedies, and we carry, asafoetida and the sulfur and spirits of peppermint and bergamot and all these things that people around here use a lot.
I think they keep coming back because they'll find things here that they will not find in any other drugstore in this city.
And if we have to make phone calls all over the country to find a manufacturer that's got the item, that we'll do it. And I've done that for years.
Even during Prohibition, the Corner Drugstore was the place to get almost anything.
When Prohibition came in, obviously, then the drugstores got a special, the associations worked through legislations where it was possible to still dispense liquor for medicinal purposes. And one would be spiritus frumenti, which is alcohol.
We had a storeroom in the basement, about the size of, I would say, about 8 by 10, that was loaded with whiskey and brandy and all the different brands of liquors.
It all was done by prescription. Several people had bad colds, and there were prescriptions for spiritus frumenti, but we didn't ever go outside the law. We just filled the prescriptions. There were lots of colds.
Made up your mind yet? I'll take chocolate. With coconuts?
The third component of the Corner Drugstore was the part people remember most fondly, the soda fountain. The marble counters, the stainless steel seltzer pumps and dispensers, revolving stools, the ice cream tables and chairs. Most customers didn't realize how costly it was to install such a fountain, something a young druggist just starting out might not be able to afford on his own.
If you were going to open up a drugstore in Plainfield, Minnesota, and there was no drugstore there, you would contact, say, Bridgman Ice Cream and tell them you're going to put in a drugstore. They would supply then the fountain and would just supply the ice cream, and then from the ice cream that you bought, the gallonage of ice cream, a certain amount off the top was charged against then the fountain. In other words, it didn't cost the druggist a penny to put in the soda fountain.
Phosphate sodas, sundaes, root beer, and, of course, Coca-Cola, a name almost synonymous with soda fountain. In 1886, Atlanta pharmacist John Pemberton took a headache remedy, invented 25 years earlier, adapted it, added carbonated water, tried it out on customers, and history was made. Asa Candler bought the rights to the formula, and drugstores across the country were licensed to dispense Coca-Cola. Eventually, it was bottled. But for years before that, the soda fountain was the only place you could get it. Mixed in the glass, a squirt of the secret syrup, a rush of seltzer, cherry cokes, lime cokes, even chocolate cokes. And of course, the person behind the counter, or at least the role he played, became an American institution, the soda jerk. It's a title thousands of Americans have been proud to claim. Among the more famous soda jerks of the 20th century, Harry Reasoner, Lucille Ball, and Harry S. Truman. The soda fountain not only brought in traffic, it kept people there, making the store a gathering place for the neighborhood.
The thing that makes a place a gathering space more than some other places is the opportunity to eat there, to eat something in public. Eating is a communal act, and if eating is legitimate in a public place, people will gather there.
Sam Stevens and his brother had a drugstore in Chicago in the 1920s.
The drugstore was a kind of a hangout for the neighborhood kids. It was just something that if you wanted to find your kid, you came to the drugstore nearest to your corner. Everybody knew everybody, and it was just a good relationship with the community. And a drugstore was considered a corner place for information.
What was true for the south side of Chicago was true across the country. The drugstore was a hangout, not just for kids, but for their parents, too. At the Corner Drugstore, you could get a cup of coffee for a nickel. At Dick Sundberg's pharmacy in St. Paul, you still can.
Well, it started in 1928 when the drugstore was open, and we had some hard times, but it's always been a kind of a gathering together. The clutch, the coffee clutch has always been our heritage.
Would you pay for my coffee?
On the house, Dave. On the house. You know, that's the reason we don't raise the coffee to a dime, because we lose twice as much to raise a dime. It's only a nickel.
Well, I don't think the price of the coffee would really change things much, you know. But it does send a message that we're welcome.
All day long, a steady stream of customers.
There's the morning coffee clutch crowd, the mailmen who come in, who are in the middle of their routes, and they stop in for their coffee and yogurt. And then in the afternoons, at 1:36 exactly, is the decaf crowd, as you saw. I don't know whether you saw them when they were here. And then in the afternoons, we'll get these gentlemen, and pretty soon the kids will start coming in.
People that live in the neighborhood come, but again, it depends. Hang out. It's kind of like the atmosphere. Cheers.
A place where everybody knows your name.
My son kind of brought it up maybe about a month ago that he says they're all Norms and Cliffords. So I tell them I'm Sam Malone. But
in the center of a big city, the closeness and loyalty of a small town. Henderson, Minnesota is a small town. Population around 750. The drugstore has been here since the town began, under 4 different owners. Bolinks, Blassings, Benders, and now Harold and Marge Smith, who bought the store in 1974. Like the drugstore families before them, they live above the store. Across the country, this was a fairly typical arrangement for pharmacists and their children.
I've often said I was born above a drugstore, raised inside of one, have a great love.
The late Senator and Vice President Hubert Humphrey was the son of a pharmacist in Dolan, South Dakota.
We used to open up the store at 7 a.m. in the morning and close at midnight, the drugstore, 6 days a week.
Hubert was a pharmacist himself until he found his true calling in politics and public service. And those long hours Humphrey mentioned were also typical of independent neighborhood drugstores. Long hours, always on call, and a total commitment to the store and his customers. The druggist was usually one of the most respected members of his community.
Let me tell you from a personal standpoint, I'm talking about my mother. I'm talking about my mother back in Sicily. And there were, 3 people that people, as they walked in this little village, would tip their hat or bow. And there was the priest and the doctor and the pharmacist. I mean, this was the highest respect you could show as you walked along. You didn't know, but you knew the position, and you just, you know.
Today, Americans might not tip their hats, but apparently they feel the same way about their pharmacists. When a recent Gallup poll asked the public which professional people they trusted the most, pharmacists were near the top of the list. What would explain that?
In the old days, you know, people in the service professions were not paid a salary. They were given stipends because if you didn't pay the doctor a salary, you made an offering. And in the country doctor, if you couldn't pay him, you give him a chicken, you know, or something like that. And if you couldn't pay, the doctor didn't withhold treatment because of your inability to pay. And it was that severing of the link, or the absence of a link between the money and the service, that provided the high respect that people received from these service people.
The guy called me over, and he was asking me about, can you fix me up something, Doc, for indigestion? And I asked him, well, what have you been taking? And he says, well, I've taken a lot of stuff. And I said, how long have you had it? And he said, 2 months. The only thing I could really tell him was, look, I said, I don't want to take your money. I said, you really need to go in and get an x-ray. And he was relieved. That's the difference. I didn't take his money, and if you want a trust relationship, somebody's going to give you advice and not ask you for money for it. But they also have
part of the trust relationship is knowing customers by name and something about their situations. At the least, it makes customers feel good. Sometimes it matters more than that. In Pelican Rapids, Minnesota, Paul Swan is a second-generation pharmacist. He took over the store from his father, Lloyd, who moved here in 1947. One day, years ago, a woman came into the store with a prescription for sleeping pills. Lloyd had gotten to know the family and something about their troubles.
I saw this dark look in her face, this sort of a resigned, suicidal look. We've seen it more than once. And
Paul remembers his father telling him what happened next.
And he called and he said, in my best judgment, doctor, I would like to empty the contents of those sleeping capsules and put in a placebo, lactose. He did that. That night, the husband called very frantic. And he said, Lloyd, what are we going to do? And my wife has taken all of the capsules. And my father said, well, you don't have to worry. It's no problem because there's nothing in them.
In the early 1930s, that trust relationship between druggists and their customers was put to the test.
The Depression was very hard on everyone, and people would come in very ill, and of course you wouldn't turn them away, and so we carried them on the books.
They'd say, well, Kermit, I don't have the money today. Would you take care of it? And I said, anything that pertains to medicine, you can have. I'll charge it. You pay me when you can.
Some of them do and some of them don't. But the idea is, life is so valuable, you don't think more of the dollar than you do the soul.
The druggist as businessman, host, friend, and counselor. But first, of course, he had to be a scientist, understanding everything about drugs. Up through the first part of this century, drugs were compounded from plants and herbs. But even before 1920, chemists had begun to create drugs in the laboratory.
No longer did we have to go out and chop a tree down and get the leaves and then macerate them and squeeze them and process them and so forth. We could manufacture them in a laboratory in a very nice, clean, concentrated way. That was the beginning then of the so-called organic pharmaceuticals.
And the period following was filled with such productive research that it's been called the golden age of drug discovery.
Gangrene, from which millions have perished in past wars, has been conquered by the miracle of penicillin.
Sulfa drugs to combat bacterial infection. Polio vaccines, vitamins, steroids, contraceptives, and tranquilizers.
Here we are in the 90s, and we're dealing with a pretty sophisticated group of drugs that you can't imagine the individual who had gotten his degree, say, in the 20s, and you've talked to one such person, the change that he has seen or she has seen in those 60 years has got to be just something that you almost cannot comprehend, the progress that has been made.
Ironically, in the 1950s, as the future was made brighter by the promise of miracle drugs, the lights began to go out on the independent neighborhood drugstores all over the country. Not all at once, and not from one single cause.
Dr. Jenrick said this at a symposium that we held on campus. He said, beware of the big syndicate stores that are going to come into the picture in the 50s and the 60s. He predicted this in 1949.
Syndicate didn't mean the mob was taking over the drugstore. It's what they called the chain stores. Chains had been around since the early 30s. Their size and buying power might have been cause for the independent druggist to worry a little, but chains didn't really affect business much for at least 2 decades. Through the 30s and 40s, independent druggists and other retailers of manufactured goods in most states were protected by fair trade laws, giving makers of pharmaceuticals and other manufactured products the right to set minimum prices for their goods. It meant everybody, large or small, had to sell at the manufacturer's suggested retail price. In the 50s, fair trade laws were challenged and eventually found to be an unfair restraint of trade. Without price restrictions, you could, in some cases, now buy drugstore prescriptions a lot cheaper in a chain store pharmacy, if you had a way of getting there.
But then, there's another handy way to get around and have fun doing it. The Renault Dauphine.
The 1950s, the decade when America really found its wheels, the automobile, and with it the loosening of ties to the neighborhood. Now a family could leave home and do its shopping anywhere they chose.
Loyalty is nice, but it also carries a price, and you're perfectly willing to be loyal as long as it doesn't cost you too much money. When the price gap got extraordinary, people just hopped in the car and went to the suburban discount pharmacy and got the prescription and saved several dollars, which in the 1950s was a significant difference. I think that's when it started to erode, simply based on mobility and on price differences. And the large, efficient vendors could capture large markets, and they did. And it's still going on.
All over America, for fast relief, it's Speedy Alka-Seltzer.
Next to go was the drugstore monopoly on over-the-counter items, like cold and stomach remedies. Supermarkets wanted to sell them too, and in a court battle in the late 1950s, won their case.
The pharmacists lost their local monopolies and then tried frantically, all during the 60s and even up until today, to try to get some of that business back. Big signs in the windows that say, we will match the discount store prices. You know, we will match your generic drug prescription prices. Please come back and shop at the neighborhood store. Their business was just going someplace else.
Over the years, other factors wore away at the independent pharmacist. Long hours, the financial squeeze, and the perception that many of the old customers didn't need them anymore. Today, it is a time of change and uncertainty for the profession.
I graduated in 1961. People in the 50s, almost everybody I remember in my class, their goal was to get out of school and open up a pharmacy, go into private business. That was the goal. Nowadays, they don't think those terms at all.
Each year, more independent pharmacists decide to end the struggle and close up. There will always be a need for pharmacists, but who will they be? Where will they work? What role will they play?
Let me know if you have any questions. Okay, great.
Who has already changed dramatically. In the mid-1920s, when Catherine Carpenter and her sister decided to become pharmacists like their father, their mother said,
she said, oh dear, I didn't want my girls to be pharmacists. I wanted them to be ladies. But then I think that she changed her mind after a while.
Up until about 20 years ago, pharmacy was a male-dominated profession. And now?
I graduated in 1981, and I believe our class was 110 or 115, and it was 40% women, 60% men.
Julie Johnson is the co-owner of Blomberg's Pharmacy, not far from Sundberg's in St. Paul.
I believe that the class that will enter pharmacy school this fall, it's 80-20, 80% women and 20% men. So in a short span of years, that ratio has really gone the other direction.
Where will they work? Well, many will continue to work in drugstores. More likely now to be large chain stores and shopping malls. A little less personal, though people who get to know their chain store pharmacists still find a lot to like and respect.
Okay, so it's just twice a day for 10 days until all the medication is finished. Okay,
But a drugstore is not the only form drug care delivery can take. In Chicago, pharmacist Abraham Morgan has opened 4 clinics that combine medical care with pharmacy services, making it easier for doctor and pharmacist to work together for the good of the patient.
Garcia Arturo.
The concept that we have here is that anything we give to someone, we want to explain to them, consult them. So they have to come in and ask for it. It's not that they pick it up and walk out the store with it. So it's from that concept that we treat and help the patient that just walks in.
Pharmacists of the future may be more important, more valued for the knowledge they can dispense than for the actual medicine.
We try to consult each individual as we wait on them. That's what's so unique about our setting. They can come right in. They don't have to have an appointment. They can come in to the reception desk and say, you know, I'm having a problem, XYZ. I'd like to see someone about it. Whatever your problem, just come in and you can get your consultation.
Pharmacists may become experts in specific drug therapies. They may even be called consulting pharmacists. Lowell Anderson is a pharmacist and president-elect of the American Pharmaceutical Association.
Increasingly, as drugs become more sophisticated and delivery systems become more complicated, the types of tablets, the types of liquids, injectables, and so on, people will find it difficult to take those drugs appropriately. These drugs are going to be high-cost drugs. And in order to get the people so they'll use them properly and get the money's worth out of them, we're going to have some person in the healthcare delivery system that can work with those people on a day-to-day basis, easily accessible. And that's the pharmacist, really.
In a few years, when the dust settles and the picture clears, will the Corner Drugstore still be there? Probably not in the form some of us enjoy remembering. But some hard-headed people in the profession believe that whatever form emerges, a close, caring, personal relationship between pharmacist and customer should and will continue to be important in the delivery of health care. And the place that happens might still be the drugstore on the corner.
Funding for this program has been provided by 3M Pharmaceuticals,